Welcome to Inside the Mavs, Mavericks podcast. Kevin Gray, Mavs insider for 105 through the fan, joined as always by my partner, Grant Afseth, Mavs SI, beat writer, insider for Sports Illustrated, covering all things for the Dallas Mavericks. Really appreciate you joining us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts for free. Also watching this on YouTube as well at Kevin Gray Sports. Really appreciate all of you taking in the podcast, giving it a 5-star rating, and writing a review for the podcast while you're there. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. You can find Grant on Twitter at Grant Afseth. A lot to get to on this episode of Inside the Mavs as we are in NBA free agency. The Mavericks making a few moves. We'll get into all of that and what still could be happening for the Dallas Mavericks throughout the course of this episode as I bring in my man, Grant Afseth. Grant, what's going on? How you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty good. It's always fun the time of year when you're on call, essentially, to write about Dante Exum at like 10 o'clock, and then you started the day writing about whatever the heck's going on at like 8 a.m. So it's always an interesting time of year for sure.
Grant got early shade for Dante Exum and the Dallas Mavericks move already. We'll get into all of that throughout the course of our time here on Inside the Mavs. Again, you can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. You can find Grant on Twitter at Grant Afseth. But let's just jump into it. We're a few days into NBA free agency. Obviously, for the Mavericks, a big offseason for them that they've got a lot of needs to address. But, Grant, as we get started, the number one move that they had to make, they were able to get it done. Kyrie Irving returns to the Dallas Mavericks on a 3-year, $126 million contract, a 2+1 deal for Kyrie and the Mavericks. He's going to be averaging $42 million a season over the next 3 seasons. You're hoping that it starts out at about 38 or so that you can have a little bit of access to that mid-level exception. Before we get into some of the specifics of it, just your overall thought on the idea that Kyrie Irving rather quickly back in the fold for the Dallas Mavericks and the number one item for them getting done for this offseason for this team.
Yeah, I think, getting that done on day one, that means a lot. Something that we were talking about before we really got into free agency was, the kind of, I guess you could say the fear or the downside of that lasting longer, like days into free agency. And you're like, is he going to come back? Who can we even target if he doesn't? Not having to worry about any of that and getting it for below a full max. A pretty good chunk below full max, I should say. That's definitely a benefit to the team. And I guess Kyrie as well, if you want to give them the spending flexibility, because, I feel like some of these teams with superstars, I guess there can be a point where the top of the roster makes a little too much for, the whole balance to take place. So, it's probably mutually beneficial that there's breathing room. He got compensated well, and they can kind of look towards other parts of the roster with the rest of their spending mechanisms, and the main one being preserving that non-taxpayer mid-level exception, and then just getting creative with the margins on the roster. As like out of left field as like the Dante Exum signing kind of was like off the radar. If you take a shot on someone at a minimum, they do well. More power to you. Use your biennial exception on a Seth Curry, like a good veteran player, and it works out. More power to you as well. But yeah, just interesting to see what they do going forward. But that Kyrie element of it was definitely the most important, and getting it out of the way early, that matters a lot.
Yeah, one source I talked to over the Mavericks about the, Kyrie Irving return, told me, quote, I think it's great he's back, and that Kyrie was extremely hardworking when he came to the Mavericks when he was acquired at the trade deadline. So this is a player who did exactly what he was supposed to do, and he came in, while, yes, the record for the Mavericks, 5-11 with Luka and Kyrie on the floor together at the same time, but in 20 games that Kyrie played, averaging 27 points per game, shooting 51% from the field. He was really efficient and provided a scoring element alongside Luka Doncic that we have not seen in that dynamic way since Luka has been a part of this franchise. And the game that I think of most is when both of them dropped over 40 points against the Philadelphia 76ers, and probably what was the signature win for this Mavericks team with the two of them on the floor at the same time. So for Kyrie, this is a chance for him to continue his journey with the Dallas Mavericks. They make good on all the things that they gave to the Brooklyn in order to ensure that they had a chance to have Kyrie's bird rights and bring him back here in the fold. And now going forward, it's about filling out the rest of this roster, but give Nico Harrison and this front office credit for handling their business and getting it done. There was, I think, some skepticism around the league. There was some different reaction to it. Some people on the extreme of the idea that it was an overpay, bidding against themselves, maybe were the Dallas Mavericks, to the other side where, look, you were able to lock up a guy who's a top 20 talent in this league to go alongside a guy who's already a 4-time first-team All-NBA selection, and Luka Doncic. So I like the move. I'm glad that they were able to get it done. And more importantly, they didn't lose a second star for the second consecutive summer after Jalen Brunson walked out the door last year. They keep Kyrie Irving in the fold. And now, as you started to mention, with some of the mechanisms that they have, that brings us to obviously what they were able to do in bringing back everybody's favorite Dallas Maverick at this point, and one Dwight Powell. Dwight Powell comes back to the Dallas Mavericks on a 3-year, $12 million deal. And I've tried to couch it this way, Grant. The Mavericks were paying Dwight Powell they paid him $33 million over the last 3 years, $11 million for each of the last 3 seasons. And now you get him back for a total of $12 million. And for me, he's going to be a mentor to Derek Lively, show him how to work with Luka Doncic and all the things that come with that. But at the same time, I think for a lot of Mavericks fans, and you can speak to some of this, they told us, and what has been reported and everything else, that they want to remake the center rotation. But as it stands right now, based on this current roster that they have, guess who's going to be the starting center on opening night? Yep, that's right. Dwight Powell is going to be the starting center on opening night based on what they have. What was your reaction, obviously, to them retaining Dwight Powell? Not an unexpected move, but at the same time, I think for some Mavericks fans, not the move that they necessarily wanted to see at this point.
Yeah, for sure. I think, a lot of the Dwight Powell stuff, I think with anything, it's important to have like nuance, like a nuanced view of it.
Sure.
I think he provides, a good amount of, dirty work, like, the little things, whatever you want to say, like a good screener, catches lobs. He knows where he's supposed to be on the rotations on defense, all that stuff. That is important to have around, especially, as you said, if you have a lottery pick center who played, a season of college basketball. He had some trouble with fouling, too often throughout his season at Duke. And needs to kind of like refine himself in those like dirty work areas or the techniques, if you will, of all those things, as any young big man would enter in the NBA. So having like an example to be able to kind of, follow, that helps quite a bit. But I guess in the, putting that aside, the greater context of, kind of like the immediate like competitiveness of the team, running it back with a lot of the same sort of like one-dimensional, limited, undersized role players, that doesn't necessarily show like, okay, this team got better. And considering they had to tank out the last couple of games, that lacks a little bit of nuance to say, because there was injuries down the stretch. Kyrie wasn't on the team to start the season. So maybe some of those clutch games could have been wins if they didn't, kind of play hot potato with the basketball. But, overall, just you like to see a talent upgrade after missing the play-in tournament, a little more significant than running it back and signing biannual exception guy and then a minimum guy and then bringing back your, most of your talent. But I think overall, in a vacuum, it is helpful to have, a guy like Dwight on a cheaper contract, especially compared to what he was making. Have him, with the, locker room, the, young player development stuff, all that stuff's great. But you definitely still need to look to get better overall. And I guess it becomes a matter of like, we don't necessarily have a perfect view of the trajectory of Derek Lively's rookie season. If they really feel super confident, let's say like, okay, well, he just needs a little bit of time, like early season, to really become that full go. He's our guy. If that's the case and they really feel that way, a stopgap option that you can feel comfortable just taking out of the lineup, that makes sense because you think it's, in the horizon, if you will. But if it's uncertain, kind of what Jaden Hardy was, it's a little different going from a second round pick comparison to a lottery pick, of course. But if you're not really sure what he's going to end up claiming or earning early on, and you're worried about kind of like mucking up the center, rotation or platoon, if you will, with non-dynamic guys that are undersized, taking away opportunity to develop, a lottery pick, I can see where there's like, kind of like a what's going on sort of perception from fans. But yeah, I think there's a lot of layers to it,
Sure.
and I think as it plays out, it'll be important to see like what's the plan like for like definitively with Derek Lively early on and how he responds to like summer league, training camp, all that stuff. As much as people don't like to hear that, it's like to be determined. Got to be a little more patient to see what other roster moves and the direction, I guess, if you will, on some of these like miniature roster focuses, if you will, like what's the plan with the center spot, what's the plan on the wing. Sometimes it takes a little bit to play out beyond like the roster moves, with player development getting kind of factored into it as well.
Yeah, and I think for Dwight Powell, look, this is a guy who's been a leader in this locker room for a long time. He's a veteran presence and someone who's going to provide tremendous leadership for Derek Lively and someone to teach him how to be a pro. And all of those things are extremely valuable given what the position the Mavericks are in and trying to help Lively come along as quickly as he can. And if you're going to be learning from someone, Dwight Powell is a model person to learn from in this league. So there's a lot of positives with him. I think for what frustrates Mavericks fans is the idea of the things that you talked about from a talent perspective and what they've got to do to modernize their center position, given the player that they're trying to keep around here in terms of Luka Doncic and how his game meshes with what a modern center could look like. And Dwight Powell is simply not that. He's going to bring the energy. He's going to bring, a lot of hustle. He's always brought those things. But this team, as Nico Harrison and his organization has constantly talked about, have got to get better in terms of rebounding, have got to get better defensively. As much as Dwight Powell brings in terms of some of those intangibles, those are things that he is not going to bring necessarily for this team. So Mark Stein, who covers, the entire league himself, was talking about this in his Substack threads today, is that the Mavericks are still trying to find a center, trying to find a quality 3-and-D wing as well. So I don't think they're necessarily done yet. But at the same time, I don't mind Dwight Powell being back here on a $4 million a year deal, given what they need to do to bring Lively along. Is the question is, how are you evaluating the Mavs? Are you evaluating them based on what they said that they were going to do to improve this offseason, or are you evaluating them based on what their roster needs are and trying to project into the future and how they can bring along a guy like Derek Lively and who is there to help him do that? If you're looking at it from either lens, you'll have a different perspective on it. But I think it's overall good to remember what the goal is in terms of bringing a Dwight Powell back. And as you mentioned, a stopgap type of center is exactly what the Mavericks need. We had heard conversations about them maybe trying to get an Andre Drummond before he opted back in to his deal with the Chicago Bulls. So they were trying to find a stopgap center on the cheap. Maybe there's still a much more quality starter that can be looked at as a long-term solution and maybe a trade over the next few days. But that's kind of where they are in terms of Dwight Powell at this point. And it makes sense given what they're trying to do. So I won't crush them too hard for it, although I would like to have seen a little bit more creativity, I guess, in terms of trying to upgrade the center position, even if you felt like they had limited resources to do it at that point.
Yeah, for sure. Because, without a doubt, there is a need for talent upgrade at multiple spots overall. And the center position was such an important part of it. With the anchor of the defense that ranked 25th in defensive rating, the 30th ranked, total rebounding percentage team, I think overall change is necessary. And I think I guess part of it overall is just the confusion, I guess, of a lot of the narrative around the 10th pick before they, moved down to 12, for weeks leading into it was kind of the baked in expectation of, oh yeah, they're going to trade the pick, for win now talent. So I guess in a way, as we said, throughout that whole period, if you don't move the 10th pick for win now talent, there's pros and cons overall, regardless of what you do. But then your mechanisms for improving the roster become pretty limited because you only have that 2027 first round pick. And, you have to attach that to some, salary to bring in difference making players. And if you're attaching the salary to, at the time it was Davis Bertans, but credit to them for, moving off of that salary without having to part with anything other than like two spots in the draft order. Or, like a Tim Hardaway or JaVale McGee. Teams aren't necessarily going to be, lining up to say, I think if we move this win now player for a, like a kind of an older role player, if you will, like we're not talking about like a 23, 24, 25-year-old. Like that's probably the recipient of that player is probably going to be a team that wants to win. And if you're moving off of a player because you don't feel that's the right piece to help you win right now, is that team, how many teams out there are going to take that on and be like, that's going to help us win while we're giving you the piece that you think you need to win? That there's probably not a whole lot out there that kind of fits that 6'5" shooting guard requirement, if you will, because there's an abundance of those players. Like you can even look at on the free agent market that's been linked to the Mavs by Michael Scotto of Hoopsite. Malik Beasley's, he's out there as well. Like if a team wants someone like that, I mean, they're not the same player like to a T, but relatively similar, like a motion shooting combo guard, if you will, 6'5". They could go out and use their non-tax MLE, if you will, to sign that guy. Would they rather trade a veteran that helps them win now in exchange for a more expensive, relatively comparable option? Probably not. So that kind of limits, I guess your trade avenues when you only have that, those types of contracts to use and your 2027 first. So I guess that's, as we said, it's going to be hard to get all of your needs addressed this offseason with that sort of, arsenal or whatever you want to call it of assets and contracts in one offseason. Especially if you're going to hold on to the 10th pick, which became, Derek Lively, and the goal is to develop, what some consider to be a raw center early on. So, it's July 2nd. It's interesting to think about that. We're talking about like an off season from a team where it's like, the official like ink to paper period hasn't even started. We're like, what are they going to do to get better? Like, oh my God, like it's kind of interesting to think of it that way, but there's still time, for trades and, making offer sheets to restricted free agents, as challenging as it may be to actually acquire one. Because, teams get that 48-hour window to match your offer sheet, or you can get into a sign and trade, which would require an asset as well and contract flexibility for that other team. So, I guess, as we always say, that's why I'm not the GM of the Dallas Mavericks, and we'll just have to see what they end up doing. But definitely still needs remain to address that rebounding, lack of positional size on the wing and at the center position, and to address, the overall defense as well.
Yeah, and there's still a few days, as you mentioned, when we get to July 6th, when those offers can be starting to be made to restricted free agents, and a couple of targets that the Mavericks could be looking at, which we'll dive into a little bit later on in the show, because there are a couple of names that are still out there who are restricted free agents that the Mavericks could be targeting, given what they still have left in terms of that mid-level exception, most of it in being able to use it on a particular target. I'm talking to you, Grant Williams, but we'll get to that here in just a little bit. But for the Mavericks, as they continue free agency so far, interesting signing, not the one that we'll get to, the Dennis Lindsey special. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But Seth Curry coming back for his third tour of duty with the Dallas Mavericks. The Dallas Mavericks bringing in the 32-year-old on the biannual exception, their $4 million biannual exception. So Seth Curry back with the Dallas Mavericks on a 2-year deal that will see him make $8 million total over the next couple of years. A guy who, of course, is a devastating three-point shooter, the only better three-point shooter in the history of the game is his brother, Stephen Curry, of course.
How unfortunate, huh?
Exactly, of course. You look at Stephen Curry, of course, the greatest three-point shooter in the history of the game. I should say, to correct myself, Seth Curry, 43.5% shooter from deep, is the third best career percentage among active players. But at the same time, a guy who's going to provide shooting. He knows this organization. But it brought up an interesting point for me, and thought is, okay, cool. You brought in Seth Curry, 32 years of age, a guy who can obviously shoot the lights out from the three-point line, can provide some scoring off the bench, but you have a guy who is making $17 million a year right now for the Mavericks, who can shoot coming off the bench and provide you some 3-point shooting. And like Seth Curry, really can't defend at this point. I'm talking about Tim Hardaway Jr. So I'm thinking, what's happening here with Tim Hardaway based on the idea of bringing in Seth Curry, who, when he came to the Philadelphia 76ers, you go back to the 2022 trade deadline, averaged nearly 15 points, shot nearly 47% from three in 19 regular season games after the trade deadline in 2022. Obviously, a tumultuous year with the Brooklyn Nets and how things shook out. Hello, Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, with Brooklyn, and it didn't work out there. What does this mean for Tim Hardaway Jr. moving forward here? Now, also with news that Eric Gordon has signed a deal with the Phoenix Suns, you would think that takes any idea of a Tim Hardaway Jr., DeAndre Ayton type of deal, takes that off the table as well. What does Seth Curry signing mean for Tim Hardaway Jr. in your mind?
Yeah, I think because overall, I think it's a pretty congested, kind of bullpen, if you will, of guards right now. Like you have
got a bunch of guards who can shoot, who can't guard.
Yeah, for sure. Like you look at the starting, like if you just think of the typical Mavericks game, right? You start off with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, and whoever's the 3 and the 4, whatever. We'll put that aside for now. It typically wasn't going to be. I guess it was in and out of at times Tim Hardaway at the 3, but going forward, if you look at kind of the rest of this guard rotation, so you have other options like Seth Curry now, Jaden Hardy, Tim Hardaway. But the tricky thing that you get into is that after that first quarter kind of ends with Luka's kind of minutes pattern, Kyrie Irving is the one that runs the bench unit typically. And I can't, I don't want to say I can't see it or it won't change or anything of that nature. But it's if you're operating off of what they did last season, how many of those guards do you want on the court at the same time with Kyrie Irving? And then it gets a little more complicated as well, because if you think of the greater, second unit at large, if you will, let's say you're playing Omax Prosper, or you're playing even like a Derek Lively at some point in the season, those players are still going to be developing. So you're going to have a lot of like I guess your back end of your defense, like with the 4 and the 5, and some stretches could be players that are still developing and figuring it out. And those are the most integral for like team defense with smaller guards and, underwhelming defenders on the perimeter, like overall between like the 1 to the 3. That gets a little
sometimes
tricky.
Having to use Maxey as your small ball 5 defender as well.
Yeah, for sure. And then it becomes another thing too, where it's like, is your perimeter going to become a little too limited defensively to the point where you might be a little reluctant to give, those minutes to those young players that you need to develop? And then it becomes a little complicated to walk the fine line of immediate like competition, and then the player development as well. And we don't know how early on the minutes are going to look for any of those guys. Of course, but with the assets that you're investing into those players, you would think that the big picture is that eventually they would come into that role, because you're not going to just throw them into the starting lineup, of course. So then it's like, how does that contextually piece together? And then it gets a little interesting too, because I didn't even mention Dante Exum as well. And he's added I think he's added weight to his frame since he was in the NBA. So he's a little more closer, emblematic to, I guess you could say, a 3, as opposed to being like 200 pounds or, a smaller guard like some of these other options. And he's got a long wingspan. So I guess if you think, could he play, the 3 in some of those lineups? And that makes a little more sense overall if you do kind of balance things out more with a trade. If you just thinking from a, big picture standpoint. At least they have maybe that option, but we don't know necessarily how much of his impact from Europe is going to translate to the NBA, and that's kind of why that roster move kind of came out of left field a little bit, because when you dig into his numbers, it makes sense to an extent. He improved as a catch and shoot player. He's got, ability to put it on the floor. He's not the most high skill guy as a shot creator or anything of that nature, but at least he can get to the rim, and he's shown a little growth in terms of making the defense pay for, I guess you could say, disrespecting him. for like going under on screens and things of that nature. So if that improvement that he's made kind of, does translate, and I guess you win that gamble, or it pays off, whatever you want to call it, then maybe you have more optionality with your lineup choices. But then it still remains the fact that you have Josh Green, you have Reggie Bullock. Are any of those guys, are you going to play them at the 4? Well, that goes back into the whole element of, that was a struggle last year because there's smaller options for that role. And then you still don't have that anchor, that big anchor to be the 5. And that, you can't be undersized at all of those positions as we saw last season, or you end up running the risk of, being one of the worst rebounding teams. It's hard to handle your assignment, hard to help more aggressively because you have to be, cognizant of, okay, well, I have to be in a position to overcompensate for being smaller. So, it's like, again, July 2nd. So it's a little crazy to get into like, oh, well, the minute distribution of the minimum contract guy and the biennial exception guy and the second year guard. But, overall, I always like to think about those things maybe a little too early, but those are just things overall to kind of keep in mind. And overall, again, as you said, what it means for Tim Hardaway, or asked, I should say, I would imagine, like, just looking at the amount of guards that there are, I would think
it's a log jam there. Yeah,
there's a big log jam, and you would think that, I know this is something that gets you in trouble of it when you think, okay, a trade is coming, because sometimes that doesn't always happen, and then it's like 3 months go by, and you're like, oh, okay, well, that's the reality, okay. But in general, depending on what's available on the trade market, I would think that you would resolve some of this log jam with, a trade. But again, I guess not to diminish the value that Tim Hardaway has provided. He was a very efficient, like, while he struggled early on in the season last year, and getting to the rim coming off of his injury, he still at least was one of those high volume catch and shoot guys that converted at a strong clip. And when his shot was falling, he did impact games. But then, now you've added other sharpshooters as well, and you're developing scoring talent. So then it's like, how much of that is necessarily, are you going to live and die by, or are you going to kind of balance things out, more before this like upcoming season kind of comes around?
And then while this may be slightly unfair, the Mavericks were able to make their Western Conference final run without Tim Hardaway Jr. So while, yes, there's an impact for him still with this team, given the skill set that he brings with his scoring off of the bench and his ability to knock down shots from 3 and the intensity that he brings, there's still an element there of what value is being brought based on the money that he's making and how attractive that could be to another team that could absorb his salary and be able to bring you a piece that you're needing to improve your roster, and the decision that goes into balancing that versus what you're needing, to address here. And you started to address, obviously, with Dante Exum being brought in for the Dallas Mavericks. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, Dennis Lindsey special, when Dennis Lindsey was working with the Utah Jazz and running their front office, he made Dante Exum the number 5 overall pick, coming out of Australia. So for him, a guy at 6'6" provides length, can guard. The questions for him throughout the course of his career was, can he be a knockdown shooter from the outside? And you saw in 74 games a year ago, a guy who's shooting, 39% from 3, average over 20 points per game. The question is, with rotational minutes, as you're talking about, is he this Mavericks next Frank Ntilikina? Because remember, when they brought in Frank Ntilikina, a guy that can guard, that's got some upside in terms of his ability to improve as a three-point shooter. And we know that didn't necessarily work out. I don't mind them taking a flyer on Exum in terms of a veteran minimum, but that is also taking up a roster spot at this point where you're feeling like there was some other needs that you could upgrade, that you could do so at a little bit more talent level again, with a few more days going into free agency with restricted free agents, which we'll get into here in a little bit. I guess I don't mind the Dante Exum flyer. I just thought it was extremely random given what this team was trying to do, but at the same time, understanding the connection that is there with this front office, specifically with Dennis Lindsey, and what they may be able to see with him in terms of a guy that could maybe have the kind of upside of giving him a second chance, because Exum hasn't been in the league since the 2020-2021 year when he was with Cleveland. So it's been a while since X has played some NBA games, but at the same time, you're hoping that there's some upside there for him coming forward for the Mavericks.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely one of those things where if it would have happened maybe like later this month and it was
Sure.
like the cherry on top, if you will, and you're like, oh, okay, that's cool. I could see where that could be beneficial. Then it would make a little more sense. But when you're waiting as a fan, I saw fan reactions online. If you're waiting for that big move and you're like, oh God, why? Like that's the reaction you see. The Dallas Mavericks have agreed to, and then you're like, oh, my hopes up, and you're like, oh God, why? I can empathize with the frustration there, because you get all this enthusiasm, optimism, and then oh, we got Kyrie out of the way. Okay, great, and then it's like, what's next? Okay, well, and then they're like, Dwight Powell's back. And some people are happy, some people are not happy, and then okay, so we still have time to prove what's next. And then that move happens later that night. I could see why the reactions a little bit were the way they were for sure. But overall, getting into like what Dante Exum can provide. I was watching a lot of his film from this last season. And it's hard to always tell like what's going to absolutely translate for someone, because there's a lot of players that get really confident playing in Europe. They have a bigger role than they tend to have on an NBA team. They look great, and then they get a contract in the NBA and they struggle. But I think overall there was some progression made in key areas that you'd like to see from Dante Exum. As we talked about, like, he improved as a catch and shoot player. He's still got it's not the most like fluid looking mechanics, but it went in a lot more. It looks better than what it was during his main stint in the NBA. But I guess if you have the size at 6'6", and you can play multiple guards together, that does give you more off the dribble skill than you would if you were just kind of playing just like the 3-and-D wing that you would have out there instead. Because that was a problem that the Mavericks did have, in quite a few lineups last year, is that they had one-dimensional catch and shoot guys that weren't really capable of attacking closeouts or aggressive taking the contested three. And I think you would still have that problem with the contested threes with Dante Exum, because he did show growth, but still it's not really his game regardless of the percentages. He really, really was efficient on the unguarded looks. There was a good difference or disparity, if you will, in the the unguarded versus guarded looks. But at least he can attack the closeout, get to the rim a little more capably than say a Reggie Bullock or even maybe a Dorian Finney-Smith prior to the trade. So I think there is some upside if things pan out, but if the shot doesn't fall at the same clip, it quickly unravels. And if you're relying on those guard skills and say he's on, let's say for example, he's on the wing, the weak side wing, gets the ball, and you want to get into a second side action. If he's struggling with the pull up threes where the other team is either switching or hedging recovering against him, and he's just missing those shots or turning them down, and it kind of slows the possession and mucks up the spacing, then that becomes a problem as well. And then it mostly becomes a limited upside to having those three guards on the court at the same time. So I think, kind of with what we've been saying about the roster at large, you got to see how things kind of translate a little bit in the actual game situation. But, if you look at the downside and the upside, I can see, both situations, what that would look like if the best outcome, the worst outcome, or even a little bit in the middle was to happen.
And that's why you call them flyers. I mean, there's potential and there's upside there based on the skill set that he brings and what the Mavericks are looking for. The question is, at this point, you talked about the timing of it. At this point in free agency, that's not necessarily you're thinking that is going to happen at this point, given the needs that they've got to address. But again, if you're going to take a flyer on a guy who's had a moderate success in the NBA, not enough, obviously, to stick the way that we thought he would based on his number 5 overall pick, status several years ago. The Mavericks feeling like there's something there. And I guess the way I'll look at it is there's clearly a vote of confidence for Dennis Lindsey to have some influence within this organization. given the fact that they're taking this flyer on a guy who he had picked several years ago and giving him a second chance. So that to me is my bigger takeaway is the front office clearly has the, ear and attention to Dennis Lindsey as well in terms of what he can do to influence how this roster is beginning to look as well, given what they've been able to do. So I think that's another interesting takeaway here for what Dennis Lindsey is going to be in terms of his influence within this front office for the Dallas Mavericks going forward here.
Yeah, for sure. Because I guess with anything, whether you're a manager or coach, you're gonna try to bring in the people that you trust. So that does seem like an indicator of like influence, if you will, or even just like the fact that that like he's been described as a a sounding board for Nico Harrison. The fact that suggestion, even filling that role, results in a signing for a player that hasn't been in the NBA. It's interesting, and I guess if it pans out, that's a real value add. That you would maybe not have otherwise had by adding another voice into the front office. But yeah, it's just interesting to kind of see how decisions may be impacted or changed in the process over time. And that's definitely something to kind of keep an eye on as well overall, because they got pretty creative even on draft night. It remains to be seen how influential everyone involved was with like the decision making process. But whatever the process went into it, it was intriguing to see moving off a bad contract, moving down 2 spots, buying an extra pick, if you will, with the trade with the Kings for the 24th pick. So just seeing like more creativity, that's always interesting as well. So just that's something to keep in mind going forward, is just I guess the style of decisions or types of decisions, kind of moving forward as they make changes to the roster.
Speaking moving forward, as we move toward a close to our show today, obviously the Mavericks now look forward to July the 6th with respect to restricted free agency. There is going to be individuals that are going to be available, and the Mavericks still with most of their mid-level exceptions still available. A guy like Grant Williams could be in play for the Dallas Mavericks. Of course, Grant Williams of the Boston Celtics has a chance to return there, while we've heard reporting that it's unlikely that Grant Williams returns to Boston. I would imagine, Grant, that Grant Williams now is at the very top of the Mavericks list, given their abilities to use that mid-level exception, and a lot of the primary targets, quote unquote, that were mentioned and linked to the Mavericks are gone off the board now. Grant Williams seems like the guy that the Mavericks are going to be targeting with that mid-level exception, and with Miles Bridges getting his qualifying offer and accepting that from the Charlotte Hornets, it looks like maybe the Hornets and the Mavericks may be in a duel here to see if they can lure Grant Williams away from the Boston Celtics when it comes to restricted free agency here starting on July 6th.
Yeah, for sure. Because I guess if you look at, as you said, the Hornets were linked by Michael Scotto as a team that, could be preparing that offer sheet for, Grant Williams. And as you said, they brought back, Miles Bridges on the qualifying offer. They still have to probably navigate, PJ Washington's restricted free agency as well. Like that's an interesting element to kind of take into consideration, is the Mavericks don't have their own restricted free agent to really worry about. But the Hornets have to determine A, if they want to keep him, what price tag they want to keep him at, and B, do they want to target someone who pretty much plays the same position? And then like, are they going to prioritize immediately making that offer sheet available? Because if they like PJ Washington, I mean, is that really like the greatest option to kind of hand out offer sheets right out of the jump for both of those guys at the same spot? Probably not. So I guess in a sense, the Mavericks at least have the luxury or the unfortunate reality, whatever you want to call it, of having clear like objectives right now, where they have money to spend. They haven't quite gotten what they've ideally wanted. They still need to add more talent. So at least that their day one of the eligibility date of being able to make that offer, maybe they can kind of position themselves a little better than other teams who got other priorities to kind of resolve by making an offer. Because other teams as well that were linked to Grant Williams, like Indiana Pacers, for example, like they were a team that was off and on mentioned as a potential suitor. They've really added a lot of fours. They have added Jarris Walker. They threw a lot of money at Bruce Brown. They have a lot of players. And, I mean, they just got Obi Toppin as well. So that's not necessarily going to be like the best, option for them now. I think Orlando was another team at times. It's been mentioned as, a potential team to throw money at Grant Williams. But, I mean, they have a lot of front court players as well. Not to get too deep into them. But overall, there's not really a ton of like high dollar teams out there with like that cap flexibility or the full non-tax MLE that may necessarily be like motivated or highly motivated to kind of pursue Grant Williams if the Mavericks do indeed intend to, make a quick offer sheet. That'll be something to watch. And then, other options out there have kind of dwindled. Like some options, people have kind of floated in ideas has it been to kind of split up that non-tax mid-level into multiple players instead of just one big offer to one player like a Grant Williams. But a lot of those like players that could be impactful are already committed to other teams. So just overall monitoring the strategy with that non-tax mid-level will be important. And also last year, the tax mid-level was used on JaVale McGee, and that didn't quite work out. So it's not like free money that you like, it's consequence free. You have to like be on target with your exceptions and make, like impactful moves. So when you do break it up into multiple players, just because it's a bigger number than last year, going from the, the tax to the non-tax, you still don't want to end up with a risky situation where you're paying $5, $6, $7 million to a player that may not pan out, because then all of a sudden you're starting to stack up some of those like, near the $10 million plus range of exception signings that haven't quite panned out that you want to move on from. So that overall, those are just some things to think about over the next, I guess you could say 2, 3, 4, whatever, how many days until, some more activity kind of takes place in the free agent market.
Yeah, and that's kind of that next, wave or tier, if you will, is when these restricted free agent guys. And for the Mavericks, they could be in a situation where they need to split up their MLE to be able to get multiple parts. Because, again, we've talked about maximizing value throughout the course of this offseason, whether it was the number 10 overall pick, which they were able to do in the NBA draft. They may need to take the same approach with the mid-level exception as well, maximizing as much value and extracting as much as they can out of that mid-level if they are not able to land a guy in Grant Williams. Would that be the preferred name that they could get based off of what's available to them right now? Yeah, it would. But if they feel like they can maximize that value by splitting it up, maybe you can address multiple needs with that mid-level exception to be able to handle things moving forward there, because this team still needs to address quite a bit, whether it be another center, another 3-and-D wing, a guy that can guard on the perimeter. They've got some things to address. So maybe if they miss out on a Grant Williams, how do they do that? By getting and extracting as much as they can out of that mid-level exception. That may be another route that they could go. We've also heard interest, speaking of Michael Scotto, the idea that the Mavericks may be interested in a guy like Terrence Davis, a free agent with the Sacramento Kings. So there are names that the Mavericks continue to be linked to that we're hearing about. The question is, how do they maximize that value with that mid-level exception there?
Yeah, definitely. Because, as we were just talking about, you don't want to end up in that situation where you're adding another unfortunate signing on your books where you're spending about like $10 million and you don't have the second round picks, after trading them in other trades to really dump somebody. But yeah, that's where the creativity definitely needs to come into play. That, I guess that's why you also don't necessarily rule out when a team gets creative and goes out and gets a guy maybe like a Dante Exum on a minimum, because you do have to take those risks. They may not look may not be the most likely moves or on the radar moves, but getting creative and taking risks, within the control of being able to get out of those moves or move on is definitely important. Like calculated risks, I should say. But in this overall free agent market, like a Terrence Davis, there's always going to be some elements of, pros and cons. Like, he can get to the rim, he can guard on the perimeter, but then he's not like the most like efficient, like floor spacing option out there. So you're going to run into a lot of situations where they're not the complete package, if you will. and that's probably why they haven't necessarily agreed to contracts already. So the not groundbreaking analysis here, but the hope is that you can get one of those restricted free agents to sign your offer sheet and their team. We're good. I think we'll just move on. That's probably your hope, and then those calculated risks become a little interesting right now because the team still hasn't filled out like a good chunk of their coaching staff as well. So if you're going to take a chance on maybe like a younger guy that needs to maybe work on his shooting mechanics, like it's kind of hard to fully bank on full confidence in that improvement if your shooting coach is now with the Chicago Bulls or something like that. So I guess those are other like factors that kind of throw into the mix as well. But yeah, definitely still need to find ways to add positional size that help you improve defense and rebounding. If not, the inside the Mavs is going to become a broken record a little bit. As we've been saying those things for a while throughout like the off-season coverage. So hopefully they get it done so we can focus on other areas for sure.
Well, I know a lot of Mavericks fans are waiting patiently to see what this team does by the time we get to July 6th and maybe being able to utilize that mid-level exception on a Grant Williams. Other names that we've heard linked to the Dallas Mavericks, as we mentioned, Terrence Davis, formerly the Sacramento Kings, Malik Beasley, formerly with the Los Angeles Lakers, a couple of names that have been mentioned and linked to the Mavericks. So a lot of names being linked, but the Mavericks at this point seeing a lot of those options start to dry up given some of the big money. I mean, look, real quick before we go, I mean, some of the money that's been handed out, we now live in an NBA world where Fred VanVleet makes more money than Kyrie Irving. Desmond Bane gets a contract extension from the Memphis Grizzlies, and he's got the same deal, that 5-year, $207 million max that Luka Doncic has. So Desmond Bane and Luka Doncic make the same money. And now you look at a Bruce Brown who got well over $20 million to go play in Indiana, to which I say to Rick Carlisle and the Pacers, okay, cool. Y'all can go ahead and have that if you're going to pay Bruce Brown over $20 million on multiple, seasons. So there's been some silly money handed out so far in free agency. I mean, the Rockets, for example, they had a bunch of money. They had the most salary cap space, I believe, than anybody in the league. So they just had a bunch of money to spend. They give Dillon Brooks over $20 million a season at $80 million for the next 4 years. They're just giving away money. In fact, they're giving away so much money. Uncle Jeff Green got $6 million to go be an adult in the room for the Houston Rockets. So the Rockets just giving away money at this point, but the Mavericks have to be able to utilize some creativity here. Otherwise, some of those needs that they are looking to address may not be done so through free agency, but maybe have to come through via trade, given some of the pieces, Tim Hardaway Jr. and others, that they may need to utilize to facilitate a trade to make it happen in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just at the time of recording, because who the
Sure.
heck knows
Correct.
what crazy sightings could happen from here on out before this goes up. But, just looking at some options that are out there just for people to kind of visualize the market right now. If you look at like the small forwards in the fours, you got Kelly Oubre, who's unrestricted. Matisse Thybulle, he is restricted. Torrey Craig, Terrence Ross, TJ Warren, Will Barton, Justin Holiday, who was a Maverick this last season. There's been some interest for, teams linked to Stanley Johnson, but he hasn't signed to my understanding yet. Justice Winslow, you got like Juan Toscano Anderson, Kevin Knox, names like that. And then you get into more.
I like Matisse Thybulle, by the way, as a name for the Dallas Mavericks.
Yeah, if they are looking to kind of shake things up with Damian Lillard's trade request, adding a wing that he's not the greatest like on ball containment guy out there, but at least like he can make some plays in the passing lanes, something like that. You gotta take risks, when you get deep into the free agent class. So I can see where. Pros and cons for sure. And then you have, the fours, PJ Washington, as we mentioned. That's probably not the fit that you want spending a lot of money on. He's a good shooter. He's a skilled player, but he's not necessarily that like defensive option that you're looking for. Grant Williams, as we've mentioned. You have JaMychal Green, Paul Reed, Paul Reed, that's an interesting, a bit of an interesting one. He's more of like his skill set's more of a 5, like an interior guy. So that might get a little like challenging to find like clean fits together. But he has talent. Then you have, there's not a lot after that. Then it gets like you get close to like Blake Griffin, older players like that, and Taj Gibson, and then our familiar, another familiar face, Markieff Morris. So there's not like a lot of great deep options that kind of like check all those boxes of being a spacer, a rebounder, defender, all those things. So yeah, definitely pull out the notebook, the notepad, whatever you will. Fire up some synergy video, and gonna have to get a little creative if some of those top guys are not necessarily available to you.
It's going to be very interesting over the next several days with all those names being mentioned and the Mavericks needing to address those needs. Some creative things are going to happen for this Mavericks team in order to get that done. We'll see if they can by the time we get to a few days from now, as of this recording, or whenever you listen to it, and the Mavericks being able to handle things when it comes to some of those restricted free agents, if something doesn't happen between now and then. Grant, tell the folks where they can find you and some of the work you've got going on as we are headlong into NBA free agency for these Dallas Mavericks.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to be writing pretty much as moves happen on DallasBasketball.com. I'll have some breakdowns of the new players that get brought in. And then also, we're getting already, it's crazy how this stuff flows right into each other. Like we're literally 2 days from the first Mavericks Summer League practice. So I'll have, analysis of those young players that they just drafted, Derek Lively and Olivier Maxence Prosper. And then, just live coverage from Vegas as well of the Summer League games. I'm looking forward to that one. I've never done that one before. So that will be definitely interesting. And I'll have to try to watch Wembanyama once. Hopefully it's not too crowded. But yeah, it will be a lot of stuff going on for sure.
Yeah, no shortage of coverage for this Mavericks team, as you mentioned, getting ready for Summer League here that will begin here in earnest in the next several days with them practicing and getting ready. Jared Dudley's going to be the head coach, of course, for the Mavericks Summer League team. So our first looks at Derek Lively and Omax Prosper are going to be fun to watch. Jaden Hardy going to be the headliner for the Dallas Mavericks, as he's going to be participating in Summer League, however long he's going to be participating for the Mavericks during the course of Summer League in Vegas. So a lot to look forward there. You can make sure you find Grant on Twitter at Grant Assets. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, dropping my Mavs news and nuggets as they come along, as we get ready for the rest of the NBA free agency and what is in another important several days for this team. A lot of still to get to when it comes to the Dallas Mavericks. That ends our show today here on Inside the Mavs. Again, really appreciate all of you who support the podcast, dropping a 5-star rating, writing a review for the podcast. It means a lot to us. Our last 4 episodes have been the most listened to episodes that we have done for Inside the Mavs. So really, really appreciate the ground support that you're giving this podcast, and everyone continuing to tell everyone about this podcast. Really appreciate it. It means a lot to us. And again, you can subscribe to Grant's YouTube channel at Grant Afseth as well. It's going to have a lot of amazing breakdowns for these players and throwing all that content up there as well. And make sure you can subscribe to my channel at Kevin Gray Sports as well for all things Inside the Mavs. Again, appreciate you joining us on this episode of Inside the Mavs. For Grant Afseth, my name is Kevin Gray. This has been Inside the Mavs. We'll talk to you later. Peace.